today's talk is about gamified health systems, how to actually have fun living a healthy lifestyle. Yeah, when we talk about a healthy lifestyle, the question, of course, is what should we do to stay healthy? And if we take a look into literature, then we see that there are some essential parts that we should take care of. So one of this is nutrition. We should eat healthily, drink enough water, but we should also do enough sports and engage in physical activity. And it would also be good to actually avoid getting sick by following certain hygiene guidelines, such as brushing teeth or washing hands. While this sounds pretty easy at first glance, we apparently do have some problems. So we're not doing so well with these things. So over half of adults in the EU are overweight. Over a quarter of Europeans do not exercise at all. And the lack of exercise puts 1 in 4 people at risk. And apparently some people don't always wash their hands after going to the bathroom. So there is some room for improvement, I would say. And when we look at what's the problem, then maybe these activities are sometimes not the most enjoyable ones, and people struggle to motivate themselves to do them. So I guess you would all agree that gamification sounds like a great idea here, right? So the idea would be to just throw some badges, points, and levels on these activities and problems such that these become more enjoyable and people become more motivated to engage in them. But it's not that easy, because simply adding game elements doesn't necessarily lead to an enjoyable experience. What needs to be considered here? Well, we first have to talk about motivation, or to be more precise, intrinsic motivation, which essentially means that people engage in an activity because the activity is perceived as inherently enjoyable. This type of motivation is dependent on the satisfaction of 3 basic psychological needs according to self-determination theory by DC and Ryan. So the first need is the need of autonomy, which describes a feeling of free will, not to interact in an externally determined way, but autonomously. In gamification, this feeling of autonomy could be supported through customization possibilities, or through an avatar or virtual character that you can customize to your needs, just to name some examples. The need for competence, on the other side, describes the feeling to be able to cope with a certain task and to achieve desired results, so to be effective. This could be supported in gamified systems, for example, through rewards like points, or celebrating milestones through achievements. Social relatedness, on the other hand, describes a feeling of being significant to others, but also feeling others as significant. So social game elements like social collaboration or competition could support this need in gamification. In fact, it's even a bit more complicated than that, even because need satisfaction, so the satisfaction of these 3 basic needs, can be dependent on contextual factors. So for example, the context in which a certain stimuli is perceived or situated. And it's also dependent on personal factors. So different people interpret certain stimuli differently, which can undermine or also support their motivation. So with this background knowledge, I will focus on the question, how can gamification increase motivation and enjoyment in the context of health? And in the following, as already said, I will present gamified systems in the domain of health and empirical investigations that we did or we worked on in the past couple of years. The first system I would like to present is Germ Destroyer. This is a gamified system to encourage people washing their hands for a long enough time. So we've seen that this apparently is a problem because people usually don't wash their hands for a long enough time. Studies in the past suggested that most people only wash for 5 seconds on average, where although it's recommended to wash for at least 15 to 20 seconds. There's also a bunch of people who do not wash their hands at all. So there's definitely a need to work on these problems. And to do so, we developed 2 components. The first one is a 3D printed add-on that you can put on the sink, which you can see in the left picture, which is connected to a Bluetooth-enabled microcontroller. And this microcontroller then communicates with a gamified tablet app in which germs are destroyed when washing hands, which you can see on the picture on the right. So once you start washing your hands, more and more germs get destroyed. You can collect points, and you see a progress bar of how long you need to wash hands to destroy all of them. Also brought a little video. I hope that this works in the stream. So here you can see the system in action. This is the Gamified tablet app. Here's the little microcontroller. And this is the thing that you can put on the tap with some sensors to measure whether hands are being present and whether water is currently flowing. And you will see now how the system looks like. So once you turn on the water, this animation appears, and as soon as you start washing your hands, germs disappear. And if you do this for a long enough time, all germs disappear, and you get a little notification or animation indicating that you did well. However, if you stop too early, the germs are becoming angry to kind of let you know that you should wash your hands for a longer time. We conducted 2 user studies, which I will now present. So the first user study was centered on the question of how enjoyable, or whether this germ destroyer application actually increases the enjoyment of washing hands. So more focused on the user experience. And the second study was focused on whether the system actually has an effect in the real world, so to say. So whether it actually changes the hand washing behavior of people in a public bathroom. So first of all, talking about the first user study, which was focused on the user experience of users. So here we conducted a user study with 14 participants, and the procedure looked roughly like that. So they were asked to wash their hands, both with germ destroyer and without germ destroyer, and the conditions were counterbalanced. And they were, in both conditions, asked to wash their hands for 20 seconds. And after each washing session, they had to fill out a couple of questionnaires. The first one was the Intrinsic Motivation Inventory, which is a validated scale to assess intrinsic motivation with 4 factors. So there's 1 factor about perceived competence and perceived autonomy. These are seen as positive predictors of intrinsic motivation. There's also a factor called pressure, which is considered a negative predictor of intrinsic motivation. And lastly, there's 1 factor called enjoyment, which is considered the self-report measure of intrinsic motivation. And we also use the positive and negative effect schedule, which can be used to measure, as the name suggests, positive and negative effect. Also, we asked participants to estimate for how long they've been washing hands. As I said, we did this once with the system and once without the system, and wanted to know whether the system has any effect on these measures. And what we can see are the results of the intrinsic motivation inventory on the left. So we see that in the baseline. So this is the hand washing session without the system, which you can see in gray here. And we see the intrinsic motivation inventory scores for the hand washing session with germ destroyer, which is shown with the green bars. And we see that there is no significant effect on 3 factors, so there's no effect on competence, choice, or pressure. But we see that enjoyment is significantly increased. It's almost doubled when using the germ destroyer application. And this effect can also be seen regarding the positive and negative effect. So also in the positive effect dimension, we saw a significant increase of positive effect, which both suggests that the germ destroyer application actually was fun for participants and increased their enjoyment. Regarding perceived duration, we found that participants estimated that they have washed their hands for a shorter time when using germ destroyer, which again underlines that apparently the system was entertaining and served as a distraction for them. What we also did, as I said, is in the wild test of the system. So now that we know that apparently germ destroyer leads to an enjoyable experience and makes hand washing more fun, we wanted to know whether this increase in fun and enjoyment actually translate in a behavioral change. So we installed the system in a public bathroom for 10 days between 8 a.m. and 3 p.m. And we, of course, measured for how long people were washing hands. But in addition, we also measured the microbial contamination on the door handle to see whether we actually have improvements in terms of hygiene. The study looked like this. So we had 5 days of a baseline phase where we just installed the measuring unit to be able to measure for how long people have been washing hands. And in the next 5 days, we installed Germ Destroyer system, so all the gamification elements unlocked, and we wanted to know whether this has an effect. Overall, we had 363 hand-washing sessions in the study. When we look at the results, the first one that I'm going to present is related to the hand-washing duration in seconds. You can see on the left the results or the mean duration of hand-washing sessions in the baseline phase without the gamification elements. And on the right, you see the effect of the gamified system. And on average, we see that there was a significant increase in hand-washing duration. In the baseline phase, people were washing hands for, on average, for 5.56 seconds, which is pretty short, so much too short, actually. But it's very well in line with past research. And with the Germ Destroyer system, we see that here also the duration almost doubled. So people were washing hands for, on average, 9.3 seconds. Also, when we have a look at how many hand-washing sessions actually washed for a long enough time, we see that in the baseline phase without the Germ Destroyer system, only 3.73% of people were washing their hands for a long enough time, whereas in the intervention phase with the Germ Destroyer system, this significantly increased to a proportion of 26.73%. Notice there's a little warning. So before presenting the results of the microbial contamination at the door handle after incubation, I just wanted to give you a heads up that some people might find this, or it might be disgusting to see these pictures for some people. So if you're currently having breakfast or so, maybe stop watching for a short time. But yeah, I personally don't think it's that dramatic, but I've heard from some people that they didn't like to see that. So there's a little warning. Here are the results of the test slides. So what we see here are the pictures of the test slides after 24 hours of incubation at 37 degrees Celsius. And what we did to analyze them is we counted the number of so-called colony forming units for each test slide and compared them against each other. So on the left, you can see the test slides before introducing Germ Destroyer, and on the right, you can see the test slides in green after introducing Germ Destroyer. So on average, we had 90.40 colony forming units in the baseline phase, and this significantly decreased to 33.6 when using Germ Destroyer. So this suggests that the microbial contamination seems to have decreased after introducing Germ Destroyer, which is a pretty cool finding, actually. To sum up this study, what we learned is that hand washing was more enjoyable, it seemed shorter, and also Germ Destroyer increased the hand washing duration. We also saw that the amount of hand washing sessions meeting the recommended duration was increased, as well as that there was a lower amount of bacteria on the door handle of the bathroom. Next, I would like to present a gamified system in the fitness context. So we're changing the health context here. What we did here is we developed a fitness application for smartphones and showed the same information on a public display as well, which was really installed at a gym, as well as on the smartphone app. So yeah, basically the system consisted of 3 parts. So one part was the Xiaomi Mi Band, which is a fitness tracker that can track steps. This was connected via Bluetooth to a smartphone application, employing several gamification elements such as competition or also badges and points. And there was also a statistic about all the other users and their performance. And the very same gamification elements were also shown on the third component, namely the public display. So here we had exactly the same gamification elements, but compared to the smartphone application, this was much more publicly available because we really installed it in the gym. And also here we conducted a user study to see whether the system has any effect on the behavior of users. We conducted a study with 12 participants over a course of 4 weeks and 3 study phases or study conditions, if you want. So first of all, we had this baseline condition where the application did not show any information to users. It was just counting steps. Then we had an app-only phase where all the gamification elements unlocked in the smartphone application, and also feedback regarding the step count was provided. And then we had a phase where, in addition to the app, the public display was introduced. And what we measured was, of course, the step count. But in addition to that, after each phase, we had questionnaires assessing the self-reported measures of physical activity with the International Physical Activity Questionnaire, as well as which kind of needs were satisfied with this application using the balanced measure of psychological needs scale. Coming to some results. So what we see here is the median step counts in white or gray, as well as the median metabolic equivalent times of the International Physical Activity Questionnaire, so the self-reported measure of physical activity. And what we see, interestingly, is that between baseline and app-only phase, there was no significant effect. So even though the step count slightly increased, and also the self-reported measure of physical activity slightly increased, we could not find a significant difference here. However, when we in addition introduced the public display, participants also significantly increased their step counts. So that's quite interesting, because only after introducing the public display, participants increased their steps, and apparently the gamification elements in the app didn't work so well in this context. So what needs to be considered here is that participants were already pretty fit, and thus might have been quite self-confident about their fitness. So you can see that in the step counts. So these are already pretty high, even in the baseline phase. Why did publicly showing the same information as in the app lead to an effect? So that was the question we, of course, wanted to answer. And what we see here is one aspect of the balanced psychological need satisfaction scale. We see that compared to the app-only phase, a significant increase in social relatedness when introducing the public display. And participants in the interview actually told us that they started socializing around the fitness data, talked to trainers and also other users when at the gym. They were also confronted by other people in the gym asking them about their performance. So it seems like the gamified system and this aspect that the system was installed in the gym publicly led to participants feeling or have a feeling of more social relatedness and a stronger feeling of belonging. And this was quite interesting, because apparently this need was satisfied by the gamified system here and was maybe the cause for the increase in step counts. However, it also needs to be considered that some participants told us in the interview that they felt pressure to keep up with others. So this potentially shifts their motivation towards less autonomous and more controlled types, which ultimately could undermine intrinsic motivation. So even worse, one participant that you can see here reported feelings of incompetence. So they said that they were not able to keep up with others due to their daily routine, and such feelings of desperation might not only shift motivation to more controlled forms, but even lead to amotivation. So this user seemed to be pretty frustrated. To sum up, we found in this study that the gamified public display led to a significant increase of step counts and self-reported physical activity. And we found that it leads to a significant increase in social relatedness, which seems to be the cause for the effects here. So far, we have seen results of gamification on behavior and motivation in two contexts, so hand washing and physical activity. And we saw that in both these contexts, gamification increased motivation and enjoyment. However, we also saw that the underlying reasons seemed different, as different basic needs were targeted and satisfied. So in Germ Destroyer, we used mainly competence-enhancing informative feedback to guide users and potentially satisfy their lack of perceived competence, because maybe people didn't know how to wash their hands properly. In the step tracking study, however, participants were already in the gym and quite active, maybe already self-confident about their fitness, but they might have lacked social relatedness because they do not interact with others at the gym frequently. Here, the social component of the system seemed to be the deciding cause for the effects. What we see here, and also in other research that I didn't present, is that the key to an enjoyable experience when using gamification can be different needs in different contexts. So it could be that in different contexts, several needs or other needs could be important compared to another context. However, we also know from self-determination theory that not only contextual factors are important to consider, but also personal factors. And the next half of the talk will focus on personal factors and what we could do in gamification design to really account for them. So what we know from research and also from case studies is that people differ in how they perceive gamification elements. So one size does not really fit all. You cannot really give the same set of gamification elements to people and everyone will have fun. So that's why it's important to consider the person or to tailor the experience to the single person. And to do so, the Hexad user typology by Andrzej Maciejewski is one model that motivates or that describes what motivates users of gamified systems. And this model is actually quite useful to be used as a personalization factor. It's closely tied to self-determination theory. So it consists of 6 user types, where the motivation of these user types is based on the needs that we've seen in self-determination theory and the types of motivation. So these 6 user types are motivated by change. So the disruptor is motivated by triggering change. This can be either in a good way, but often it's more like in a bad way, or in a way that the disruptor wants to test the gamified system's boundaries, for example. The free spirit has quite similar motivations, but rather in a good sense. So they are driven by autonomy, they want to explore, they want to customize, for example. Achievers, on the other hand, are motivated by mastery and competence. So they are really like to reach goals, they like to overcome challenges in a gamified system. Players, on the other side, are rather driven by getting rewards. So they would like do almost everything or anything to earn rewards, and are really motivated to get prizes and external rewards in the system. The socializer, on the other hand, is motivated by relatedness. So social interaction is very important, communicating with others, exchanging with others, which is quite similar for the philanthropist. The philanthropist is also a very social type, but in contrast to the socializer, the philanthropist is not that much motivated by social interaction, but rather by taking care of others, by organizing, and is motivated by having or by purpose. And oh, now I have some sound here. Okay, I hope you can't hear the sound. I can hear it. I don't know why I actually turned it off. But what we see here is that, or what I wanted to say is that, luckily there are ways of assessing Hexad user types. So when we want to use the Hexad type of users to tailor a gamified experience, it's quite important to have tools to assess Hexad user types. And there are 2 or even more ways, but I want to present 2 ways here to do this. So one is using the empirical or empirically validated questionnaire by Gustavo Tondello et al. So this is a 24-item questionnaire that can be used to assess the Hexad user type of users, and is very well suited for scientific purposes. On the other hand, we also in the past worked on a solution that is maybe that it doesn't maybe disturb the gameful experience as much as a questionnaire, and we were interested in trying to predict Hexad user types by using gameful applications themselves. So we essentially gamified this process of assessing Hexad user types, and this also worked pretty well. So what I wanted to say here is that there are tools outside to assess the Hexad user types of participants, and this enables us to use it as a factor for personalization and to account for these interpersonal differences. But before we actually do that, we of course need to know whether Hexad user types actually explain interpersonal differences in how people perceive certain gamification elements. And we actually conducted 2 studies that I wanted to present here. So we wanted to know whether the Hexad user type could be used to tailor gamified experience or gameful experiences in the context of health. And we did a study in the context of healthy eating. So here we created storyboards for certain gamification elements in the context of eating healthily. Overall, we created 12 such storyboards explaining 12 commonly used gamification elements. You see an example for badges and for points here. We also did a pre-study to make sure that they are comprehensible and actually explain the intended gamification element. And afterwards, we used these storyboards explaining gamification elements in an online survey where we wanted to know how persuasive participants perceive these storyboards or these gamification elements to be. And what we did is we presented them, the 12 storyboards, in a randomized order in an online survey, and also assessed the Hexad user type by using the Hexad, so the validated Hexad user type scale by Tondello et al. And then we were interested in understanding whether there are correlations between the Hexad user type score on the different user types and the perceived persuasiveness of the different gamification elements. In this user study, 237 participants took part. And what we see here are the significant correlations that we found. So, for example, we found that achievers are motivated by personalized goals, by challenges, that philanthropists are motivated by knowledge sharing and social collaboration, that socializers like all the social gamification elements such as competition and collaboration, free spirits like unlockable content. So this was pretty much what we would have expected based on self-determination theory. And these correlations now really help us if we are implementing a gamified system in the context of healthy eating. So these findings can directly be used to decide which gamification elements to offer to which users. And we did the same in the physical activity context. So we translated the storyboard, so to say, to the physical activity domain and presented or did the very same study to see whether these correlations that we found in the healthy eating context actually can also be found in the physical activity context. And here we had 179 participants, and we found actually that the same gamification elements are more or less interesting for the same kind of user type. So we also saw that challenges and personalized goals are important for achievers, knowledge sharing for philanthropists, the social game elements for the socializers. But interestingly, we also found some differences. So if we look at the healthy eating and the physical activity domain, we saw that some gamification elements independent of the Hexad user type were different. So were perceived as significantly more or less persuasive in a certain domain or context. So for example, we found that cheating was significantly more was perceived as significantly more persuasive in the healthy eating domain than in the physical activity domain. And also we found that social game elements such as social collaboration and social competition were perceived as more persuasive in the physical activity domain than in the healthy eating domain. So it kind of underlines what we've seen in the first few slides, namely that the context is important and that we really should pay close attention to the usage context, because overall it seems like gamification elements can be perceived differently depending on the context in which they are investigated or used. So a potential explanation, of course this is only speculation, but could be that in the healthy eating domain, the feeling of autonomy or the basic need for autonomy was maybe a little bit diminished because people had to pay attention to what they eat. So this is a context where you really not really act in an autonomous form. It maybe cheating was one way to satisfy this need, to really say, no, I don't like to be controlled by the system. I want to cheat the system because I want to express or have more autonomy. In the physical activity domain, it could be on the other side that maybe social game elements are more interesting because the physical activity domain might be a little bit more, or performance might be a little bit more important here, and really measuring how well you're doing compared to others might be more interesting in this context. So the thing to keep in mind here is that Hexad user types can explain preferences for gamification elements. We found that in two health domains, so in healthy eating and physical activity, we found more or less the same correlations. So they could actually be used to personalize gamified health systems. But we also need to consider and keep in mind that the perception of gamification elements also differs across these contexts. And now that we know that Hexad user types explain the differences in the perception of gamification elements, we're also interested in knowing whether this differences in perception actually lead to effects in the real world, so to say. So while participants were rating storyboards and were not really able to interact with the gamified system, we wanted to know whether these perceptual differences translate into behavioral differences when actually being confronted with a gamified system. So we did 2 studies to investigate that. So first, we conducted a lab study where people were running on a treadmill and were interacting with the gamified application. And in the second study I'm presenting, an in-the-wild study, where we were allowed to integrate gamification elements into a commercial course booking platform of a gym. And we measured whether the course booking behavior was affected by gamification, and especially whether personalization to the Hexad user type of a certain user actually has an effect on the course booking behavior. But first of all, I'm talking about the personalized gamification on a treadmill study. So here we implemented Endless Universe, which was a gameful application using a set or a static set of gamification elements. So we had a leaderboard, we had badges, we had points, and these gamification elements should be relevant for the Hexad user types player, socializer, and achiever. So we've seen this in a previous study that I presented, that these user types should actually perceive these elements better than other user types. So we wanted to know whether this perception really translates into a change of behavior or also a change of user experience when actually confronted with a real system. So to investigate that, we did the following study. So first of all, we wanted to get to know the Hexad user type of participants. So we let them fill out the Hexad questionnaire. Then participants were running on a treadmill without any kind of feedback. There was no gamification. After running, we let them rate their perceived exertion, as well as use the intrinsic motivation inventory and the positive and negative effect schedule again. Then there was a break of at least 2 days, and then participants came back to the lab and were running again, this time with the gamified system, and we used the same measures again afterwards. Overall, we had 20 participants, and as you can see, this was within subject design. When looking at the results, we were first, of course, interested in the general effect of gamification without paying attention to the user type. Did the gamification work, basically? That was the question. And what we see here is that, yes, it apparently worked because participants increased their distance that they covered compared. So they were running for more, or they were having a higher distance in the intervention phase compared to the baseline. And also they rated their perceived exertion higher in the intervention phase when being given these gamification elements. We can also see a significant increase in competence, but also in pressure. So of course it needs to be considered that all these gamification elements introduced goals, and they were or could be perceived as controlling their behavior. So there was more pressure when introducing gamification here and less choice. When looking at whether the Hexad user type was moderating this effect, we found certain correlations. Of course, we had a quite low sample size to do this, but still this gives us some indication of potential relationships. So we see that competence was significantly correlated or positively correlated to a social, so the socializer score that participants had. So this was as expected, because we expected that the gamification elements that we introduced should be particularly suitable for the socializer, for example. We also saw that there was a positive correlation between the free spirit factor and the pressure factor. So it seems like the free spirit, which is a type that loves autonomy, is pressured by gamification elements which are not suitable for this kind of type, because they introduce goals and they are really controlling behavior. So we see that this is also something that we would have expected beforehand. Also, we see that disruptors, who are also a very kind of autonomous user type, did not improve their performance. So it was also, we saw a negative correlation between distance improvement and the score on the disruptor subscale. So to sum up this study, we saw that gamification can indeed increase the user experience and performance, and that Hexad user types can explain the user experience of a gamified system to a certain extent. But we could not find any effect on the performance of users. So we could not find that personalization or getting suitable gamification elements actually has an effect on the performance. And this is something that we wanted to investigate in the last study that I'm presenting. So yeah, as I said, the user experience was affected by personalization, but not the performance. So we thought maybe it was just too short, so we just had one run in the lab. Let's do a long-term study and see whether this increased user experience translates to effects on behavior and performance. So we did an in-the-wild study of 2 years, and we were, as I said, allowed to integrate gamification elements into a commercial course booking system of a gym. And you can see this on the left. We integrated levels, points. We also integrated achievements and badges, as well as a high score list. So again, based on our studies that we did, we expected that these gamification elements should be particularly suitable for the player, socializer, and achiever types. And to investigate whether this actually holds and whether personalization would have an effect, we did the following study. So we had a baseline phase where we measured course participation for 1 year without introducing any gamification elements. Then participants were asked to fill out the Hexad questionnaire. And then we had a phase of 1 year again where the gamification elements were activated in the system. And to analyze the data later on, we split participants into 2 groups. So we first had a group which we call suitable, where participants were grouped that received suitable gamification elements according to their player type or user type. So based on the Hexad user type that we assessed, we did this grouping here. So when they were scoring particularly high in the player, socializer, or achiever factors of the Hexad model, we were grouping them in the suitable user type, suitable group, and if not, we were grouping them in the not suitable group. And overall, we had 52 participants, and due to GDPR regulations, we had to do a completely anonymous study here, so we can report really the demographics or something like that. So first of all, again, and similar to the previous study, we were interested in checking whether gamification had an effect on the course booking behavior. And what we see here is that independent of the personalization or whether participants received suitable or unsuitable gamification elements, we see that gamification had a significant effect on the course booking behavior of users. So on the left, you see, on the picture on the left, you see the blue part, which is the baseline phase, and the orange part, which describes the course bookings in the year in which gamification was introduced. And overall, we found a significant effect between these years, so there was an increase in course bookings. Due to COVID-19, so the study was conducted, or the intervention phase was in 2020. We had to remove 3 months due to a nationwide lockdown, so March, April, and May from the data set, and to enhance comparability, we also did that in the control or in the baseline data. So as I said, we see that overall gamification had an effect, but also when looking at the month-by-month comparisons, we see that in 5 out of, I think, how many months did we have? 9 overall. In 5 out of 9 months, we see that there was a significant increase in course bookings. So we can conclude that gamification really had an effect on the course booking behavior of users. Now, coming to the main question. So we were really interested in whether personalization worked and whether receiving suitable gamification elements has an effect. And what we see is that when comparing the participation and the course booking behavior of users, we see that those users who received suitable gamification elements increased their participation significantly more than those users who did not receive suitable gamification elements. And this effect was quite big. So we had a Cohen's d of 0.4, which is quite a medium to large effect size. So this was pretty interesting and pretty cool because we had some evidence that personalization seems to work, and it seems to be quite important to tailor the set of gamification elements to the user in order to enhance the outcomes of gamification and also to have an effect on the behavior of users. To sum up, in this study, we saw that, again, gamification was effective and increased the number of book courses, even independent of whether people received suitable or not suitable gamification elements. But we saw that personalizing the set of gamification elements to the user's Hexad type increased the effectiveness of gamification. So, based on our studies, what would be the answer here? So, how can gamification increase motivation and enjoyment in the context of health? Well, I think we can talk about maybe some takeaways that we can derive based on the results. So first of all, gamification, we saw that it can satisfy basic needs. So this can lead to increased enjoyment, increased motivation, and it can even change behavior. So we can conclude that gamification definitely has great potential for private and public health. But we have to consider that adding gamification is not inherently valuable. So there are some issues and limitations, and not everyone is affected by gamification elements, and not every gamification element works in every context. And if we take a look into literature, we also see literature reviews that report that almost half of interventions that use gamification are not fully successful. Therefore, it's very important to consider, for instance, contextual factors. So I would definitely recommend, based on our findings, to consider the application context and the basic needs being inherently diminished in this context. These should be supported, and game elements could be used to do that. So there's different research showing that specific game elements can support specific basic needs. And these could be used to enhance the needs that are being inherently diminished in a certain application context. But equally important, it's very important to also look at personal factors and consider the motivational orientations of your users and tailor their experience. We've seen in these last two studies that that based on personalization, you can really have positive effects on the user experience and on the performance of users. So it's definitely worthwhile to provide a tailored experience. Because users actually differ in how they perceive and interpret certain game elements. And with these main takeaways, I would like to conclude, and I hope that the talk provided some interesting insights on the research that we conducted in the past few years in the area of gamification at health, and I'm really happy to take questions now and get in touch with you. So, thank you.
Brilliant, Max. Fantastic talk. I feel like you've set the scene for the whole day and maybe answered lots of questions. The one thing for me is I'm now inspired to be a full-time researcher. Just the series of case studies and bits of research you've done are just so interesting, and taking each bit and moving it on a bit. I'm gonna put some stuff on the screen because as well as questions, we've had some great feedback. So this was just about germ destroyer. And there's a very complex system for only washing hands. I think there's a question there, which is it looked complicated, but was it for users? I lost Max.
Yeah, here I am again. I think there was a connection issue. I don't know.
Yeah.
All right.
So I feel like there's a question here. This is about germ destroyer, which was It looked quite complicated. Was that just because of how you're presenting it? What did the user feel?
So what was the question? I think I can't.
So there was a lot of. I've got a bit of. I don't know if you can see it on the screen. It says wow, it's a very complex system for only washing hands. This is about germ destroyer.
Okay. Yeah, actually, it was not that complex, I would say. So maybe the technical setup was complex, but I think for the users, it was a quite natural interaction. So they were washing hands as they were always doing. And in addition to what they were always doing, they were having this display showing the gamification elements. So I think it was not much of a difference for users, but of course, in terms of the technical system, it was a complex way of washing hands. Yeah, I would agree.
Okay, we've got a question from Victoria. Let me just take your slides off screen, and then we.
Oh yeah, now I can see them better. Yeah.
Hang on. That's better.
That's better. Perfect. All right. Did you study the possibility of people designing their own health games for themselves? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. That's a very good question because we actually did that. So it was not the focus of my research, I would say, but I was participating in this research, and a colleague of mine, Pascal Lessel, did a lot of studies regarding or focusing on the autonomy part. And here we were really interested in how much autonomy is actually wanted and needed by participants and how they use this form of autonomy. And we did really a bunch of studies in this direction, and maybe I can talk about the two extremes. So we had one very simple form of autonomy where we allowed participants to simply turn on or off gamification. So they could just toggle a switch and say, I want to have gamification, and toggle it again to say, I don't want to have it. And we were able to show that this little form of autonomy has great effects. So we were able to show that even if participants turned this off, they increased their performance compared to a group that was not given a choice and had no gamification elements. So this little form of autonomy really had a difference, which was quite cool. And to answer this question, the other end of the spectrum was we really asked participants, well, if you were a game or gamification designer, how would a gamification design look like in this context? And they were able to provide a free text answer to this and could come up with their own game or gamification concept. And what we did is we really implemented their gamification concept in a user study and checked whether this had an effect. And also here we were able to show that when participants received exactly the gamification concept that they were telling us or describing, they also provided, in this case, more text. So this was an image tagging task compared to those who were not given this autonomy. So this definitely affects people. And what we learned from a third study is, I would say, but it should not be too complicated. So we also had a study where gamification elements could be turned on and off on a single basis. So you could say, I want to have badges and points, but I don't want to have leaderboards. And they could even customize the gamification elements themselves again. So they could say, what's the order of the leaderboard? How does the leaderboard work? And this was too much. So I would say it needs to be a kind of a trade-off between usability of a system and the number or the amount of choice that you're offering. But yeah, it definitely is a very interesting basic need, and it should be considered for meaningful gamification, I would say.
Well, that was a pretty comprehensive answer to that question from Victoria. Yeah, fantastic. So be careful not to overcomplicate.
True.
But people like choice. So
exactly.
It's one of those things, isn't it? Exactly, what am I going to put up next? This is a compliment from Anna-Reza. Now I can't remember which bit you were talking about, but when you mentioned the self-determination theory, in one of the case
that's
studies,
a very nice compliment. Thank you. Yeah.
But he does have a question, so let's get this one up. And I think this is fascinating as well, because I've run the questionnaire from Gustavo in workshops, and people will come to me and say, what does this mean? Yeah. So what are they really thinking when they apply, when they're answering the questionnaire?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it's one of those questions that is really true for many of these validated questionnaires. So sometimes they're not a good fit. And I think the good thing about Hexad is that it's not coupled to games. So when we compare this to other questionnaires like, I don't know, brain hacks, for example, or other user type or gamer type or player type questionnaires, they are really tied to games, and you really need to know, or you have to have game specific knowledge. So I think this is not true for the Hexad, or not as much true as for other questionnaires, which is really cool, because people also with no game background can take these questions. However, I definitely agree that some of these questions are really hard to understand for some people. Which is why we worked on this gameful assessment of user types that I presented really shortly. So this could be a direction that could help people, because they're essentially just interacting with a gameful application, and based on their behavior in this gameful application, the Hexad user type can be predicted to a certain extent. So this could be useful for systems in the industry, or that don't need to have this scientific rigor, I would say. Regarding the second question, whether we've tried mapping personality type from other tests to Hexad, I personally haven't done that, but I know that Gustavo did that. So in the work of Gustavo Tondello, you can find correlations between Big Five and Hexad. So there's a study from 2016 that definitely did that. And I think also in this empirical validation this was done. So there are definitely correlations between Hexad types and Big Five personality traits.
That's cool. And I know Gustavo has a ticket for tomorrow, so hang out on the chat and catch up with him there.
Yeah.
That was a fantastic answer. Oh, that gamefulness, I just want to know a bit more about that, because I think that's interesting. So if you put in that gamefulness assessment, so by playing, you're finding out something for all 6 player types.
Yeah, exactly. That was the idea. So we had gamification elements, or we had all gamification elements. I think it was 6 or so that we integrated in a gameful app. And we expected that when participants are free to choose with which gamification element they would like to interact, they will interact to those gamification elements that should be relevant based on the Hexad type. And this was at least partially true. So we could predict the Hexad type to a certain extent. It was, I think, good enough to maybe tailor a gamified system in practice, but not good enough to use it for scientific purposes. On the other hand, we had a different gameful application where we really had the statements or the core of the statements of the Hexad questionnaire, and participants were asked to click on the statement that they agree more. So it was easier for them, I would say, so not to have to answer 5-point or 7-point scales and not to read the full sentence, but only the core or the essence of the statement. And here we were closer to the Hexad type. So here we really had a good prediction and still an enjoyable experience of users. So I think this could be a quite good compromise then.
That sounds right. I'm going to have to read more about that as well, aren't I? Okay, so thank you so much, Maximilian. That was just a fantastic talk. The comments in the chat are like, great talk, awesome. Thank you,
thank you so much.
Thank you.